Hey everyone, Kathy the Vegan Prepper here, and today I spent some time putting a bunch of dried beans into glass jars. Let's talk about it. Do-do-do, do-do-do, vegan prepper. Do-do-do, do-do-do, vegan prepper. I absolutely love my working bucket set up here. I don't know, I just adore, for the most part, getting in and out of these buckets and working, making my food from scratch, from whole, dry ingredients. There's not many minuses to this whole thing. However, occasionally it feels like there might be a little bit of a con to the setup, being that the very large buckets hold about 25 pounds each usually. Sometimes they can hold even more than that, although typically I'm not putting any more than a 25-pound bag into one of these buckets. And every now and then it feels like a little bit too much to lift, hence the project of making smaller containers of beans for those times when it might be necessary. The primary challenge that I deal with, specifically related to larger buckets like this, is my lower back. Several years ago, a very short version of the story is I cracked my tailbone. It took me absolutely forever to recover from that. And then even once I had recovered to the point that I could actually sit down without huge amounts of pain, I still just have my lower back has just kind of never really been the same. Praise God though, good news is I've found a chiropractor in these last several months who's been working with me, and I feel almost like I have a new back. It's an amazing feeling after dealing with it for that long to start seeing improvement. But basically every now and then, when I've been doing a lot of really heavy work, especially any kind of work outside, like right now we're doing tons of work outside. I live in Arizona. It's January, which might sound weird, but this is kind of our primary planting season. From October to March is when we grow the most food. So that's when I'm doing the most work outside. And my back can get a little bit I call it tweaky, is how I describe it. Hopefully that's not an offensive term. I should have texted Adam and asked him if tweaky is bad to say, because a lot of times I'll just say something and he'll be like, don't say that. He's a little more in touch with these things than I am. But anyway, hopefully it's not offensive. I don't mean for it to be if it is. But yeah, my back gets tweaky, meaning it's on the cusp of potentially tweaking or even going out altogether. And in those moments, I know it's time to go ahead and start some St. John's wort tincture. St. John's wort tincture is amazing for back and spinal issues. And then, at least it has been shown to be effective against those things. It's been helpful in my life. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say unequivocally that it works. Anyway, but I also need to start heat, I need to start ice, and I need to have kind of a moratorium on really heavy lifting. So one of the things that I have decided to start doing is just having some pint jars of dried beans in my pantry, where I'm not necessarily going to use these every single time I need beans, but to basically have them there for those times when my back is tweaky and I shouldn't be lifting the buckets. So basically I've just taken all of our most used beans, which are my mung beans, my garbanzo beans, red lentils, black beans, and pinto beans, and made several pint-sized jars of just the dried beans. Now, I haven't dry canned them. I'm not planning on vacuum sealing them. I'm not planning on doing anything to them except filling them up with beans, and then once I empty them, I will just refill them with beans. That's basically my plan. Beans last a ridiculously long time. I think a lot of the steps that people go through for their really long-term storage of their beans are potentially unnecessary, unless you truly are planning on having that item for, 20 or 30 years. If you're planning on using it, relatively soon, and by relatively soon, I mean within the next couple of years, I don't know that it's necessarily even necessary to take all those extra steps. Beans are an amazing food. They're just incredible. And yeah, they store for a really long time, just kind of all by themselves as they sit. And so basically, I thought that I would also discuss, because I can't do this without also collecting data With the jars, in case any of you have the same kinds of issues where you have, I don't know, maybe a lack of mobility, you're not able to lift 25-pound bags, but you would like to purchase in bulk, to have a little bit of data on hand so that you can do a little bit of math and maybe figure out how many jars you need. And yeah, we'll just talk about that. For each of these different types of beans, I weighed them as I made the jars, and every single style that you see here, from the slightly larger chickpea to the very small red lentil, every single one ranged anywhere from about 13.5 ounces to just over 14 ounces for 2 cups of the bean, just across the board. So that, I think, is the piece that's really important to know. So say you get yourself a 25-pound bag of beans that you would like to store in smaller amounts like this, you will need something like probably 28 pint-sized jars for storing the entire 25-pound bag, or you would need probably 14 quart-sized jars for storing the beans if you were doing it in quarts. And then that's just, you know, good information to have. So why did I mainly choose pints? I just did a whole bunch of quarts of these white beans because I was also emptying the white bean bucket. These are my cannellini beans. We just don't use these very often. They don't need to be in a working bucket, I don't believe. I am transforming the cannellini bean bucket into my soybean bucket. I just got that 25-pound bag of organic soybeans from Azure Standard to start making all of our own soy milk and tofu, and hopefully very soon soy yogurts and tempeh and all of that, which I'm actually absolutely going to be talking about on the channel. So that bucket is now becoming the soybean bucket because I think I'm going to be dipping into the soybeans much more than I was with the cannellini beans. That being said, I chose the pint size because it seems that 9 times out of 10 when I am going to cook dried beans, even dried beans for some of my most used specific recipes, I always need 2 cups of dried beans. That is partly due, I think, to the size of our family and the fact that basically with every single meal, we use the equivalent of 4 store-bought cans of beans for a meal that feeds all of us. And 2 cups of dried beans turns into right around 6 cups of cooked beans, which is essentially the equivalent of 4 store-bought cans of beans, at least that kind of standard size. I think it was a 14 ounces. I'm sorry, I don't remember because I don't have cans of beans in my house anymore. But I just know for myself, 1 cup of dried beans equals about 2 cans of store-bought beans, and that's how I use them in my recipes. I have a whole video talking about my switch from canned beans to dried beans, and I will link that down below. And so basically it becomes a very easy thing for me to take 2 cups of beans, and now this is going to be even easier. Just dump it into a strainer, rinse, toss it in the Instant Pot, 6 cups of water across the board. It's 6 cups of water, 3 cups of water per 1 cup of dried beans into the Instant Pot. Cook it for however long the beans need to cook, and then I will have the beans that I need for the meal. Generally speaking, when I do this, my larger beans, such as and I'm trying to see, can you see? Not very well. The larger beans, like say the chickpeas, the black beans, the pinto beans, and then, you know, the white beans too. Those I tend to just cook plain, and then they get added in to whatever recipe. With, you know, pinto beans, they might get turned into refried beans, or just dumped into a chili. Black beans too, a lot of times just dumped into a chili or dumped into a soup. I tend to not cook these, I guess, with like flavorings. It's just the water. I'm just cooking beans, and that's what I'm doing. With the chickpeas, same exact thing. They also obviously get turned into hummus. I put into my lasagna recipe. I can link my lasagna recipe down below. The hummus It goes into the lasagna recipe. And so these will make hummus, but also it's just a really great bean. Like this is our favorite bean, except for Adam. He hates chickpeas. But me and the kids eat chickpeas. And I love turning these into a curry. So like even just today for lunch, it's so simple to cook this way. The Instant Pot, before I went to pick Sage up from preschool, I put chickpeas into my Instant Pot. When I got home, I threw rice onto the stove. I should have put rice into an Instant Pot, but I'm pretty sure the other Instant Pot was dirty, and that's why I didn't do that. I'm looking over there because it's still dirty. But anyway, I did rice on the stove. And then while the rice was cooking, I just threw together a quick simmer sauce. Simmer sauce recipes, if you like curry, if you like Indian food, that's a great thing to have in your repertoire as well. Usually sort of based on a coconut milk. And then I'd like tomato paste and a whole bunch of spices, simmer it together with onions and whatever other veggies you like. And after, 15 minutes or so of simmering, we pull the beans out, put those in there to cook in there. And then the starches from the beans thicken up the sauce beautifully. It's a delicious thing. And that's what we had for our lunch, was just, that curry, chickpea, simmer sauce and rice. And so if you look up simmer sauce recipes, you will find them. But anyway, I don't really have a specific recipe, which is why I'm not sharing that with you right this second. But yeah, just in general, it's a very easy way to cook. And so that's one of the ways that I like to cook a lot. And then, so generally speaking, as I said, it's like the flavor with the big beans gets added after the fact. I could have saved all of that time and just said that. However, with the smaller beans, so for instance, here I've got my mung beans and my red lentils. A lot of times my smaller beans, and that goes for like a brown lentil as well, those get cooked directly into the recipe that is calling for this specific type of bean, whether it's the Rainbow Plant Life red lentil curry, which I make, pretty true to the way that Nisha originally made it. I will link it down below. It's a delicious recipe. I don't put oil in, and I leave out the extra fat, like the extra almond butter. And I also I use 2 cups of red lentils because I'm doubling the recipe, and I only use 1 can of coconut milk for the whole thing. But that's a relatively frequent recipe in our house, is the red lentil curry, which I absolutely love. There's also this mung bean curry that we absolutely love, that I will link down below as well. It's a recipe I essentially stay true to for the Instant Pot. Both of those things get cooked directly into their curry. I think relatively obviously, not to be overly simplistic, but just in case, to get your brain thinking about it in case you hadn't thought about it before, it sort of makes sense because the smaller beans take much less time to cook. So they get cooked directly into their recipe, whereas the larger beans typically, on a stove or whatever, that would have taken, several hours to cook those beans. And so they almost tend to get added into things after they get cooked. I don't know. At least that's how I work it in my kitchen. But that's what I'm basically planning. And so, yeah, you can plan to potentially store your beans the same way, to help with maybe some mobility issues if you can't lift those big buckets. Keeping in mind that, smaller buckets are always an option. I still really appreciate my setup. It's easy. There's not, a million jars to deal with. I'm going to have to figure out where these are going now. They take up a lot more room like this than they do just like in a bucket on a shelf. So there's a lot of pluses to having it like that. But I'm also realizing that building some ease into my days and ease into those days when I need some ease in my days is a good thing. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I just thought I'd sort of talk about some of the particulars of why, and then also primarily get you that figure of how many ounces each one of these is, so that you can know if you're doing your own planning. Again, it was something, what was it, like 28 pint jars for a 25-pound bag of beans, and then probably about 14 quart jars. So if you've ever done any canning, you probably already have that on hand. Oh, and I just remembered or realized somebody out there's probably like, well, why don't you just can them? Well, if you're asking me that, you're new. So generally speaking, canning and me are not really friends. We just sort of, we exist amicably, but we don't really talk to each other. So basically, for one thing, there's not really like a safe canning recipe for things like red lentils or mung beans or brown lentils. And so you don't really have quite as many options. For another thing I just mentioned, space. If I, like I said, this is the equivalent of 4 cans of store-bought beans. Theoretically, that would also mean that if I were to can these instead of just tossing them dry into a jar, it would be 4 jars instead of only 1. Space becomes one of the primary reasons that I don't do a lot of canning. Also time, also energy. To me, and I guess because of how I just cook in my Instant Pot, like it's so fast and it's just such a quick and easy thing to do. It's not something that I have to think about, you know, simmering on the stove for hours, or I'm not avoiding an unpleasant workload by canning. I'm creating an unpleasant workload by canning, basically, is what I'm trying to say. The other thing is, because I mentioned before, I do live in Arizona, and I live in the Phoenix area. So probably for me personally, us personally, when we're thinking of like the prepper scenarios or like prepper disaster type scenarios, number 1 would have to be losing access to water in the city. Though we have prepped a lot for that. Number 2 would be losing power in the middle of summer. So if something like that should happen, if we were to lose power for an extended time during summer, our house probably within half a day would exceed temperatures of 95 degrees, anywhere from 96 to 97 degrees. We did have our power go out a few years ago in September, and by the end of the evening, it was 97 degrees in our house, and that was September. Not talking May, June, July, and August. So not to mention those things. So basically, if I were to focus a lot of my energy on home canning, I am potentially putting my entire food store at risk, because those are temperatures exceeding kind of like the safe level as far as maintaining the integrity of seals on canned items. And I don't have a cold storage area in my house. I don't have a place where things would stay cool. So yes, I focus a huge amount of my time and energy and effort into storing just dry goods, because that's what I feel safest storing, and it just makes the most sense for me for where I live. And I have prepared water, you know, for people who say, oh, but you need water for that. You know, I also have all the means and all the things that I need to cook any of this without power should I need to. So yeah, we're pretty good. So anyway, that's a little bit of the reasoning behind that for anybody who's asking, why don't you just can them? For me personally, I just don't believe it makes sense. So anyway, there you go. Beans in jars. I managed to turn that into a big video. I don't know. I'm just like really good at that. Okay. And so I guess let me know down below in the comments, like what you think of any of this. If you have any tips or ideas or things to add, I'd love to hear it. And I'm just going to go ahead and leave for now. As always, I hope the rest of your day is good and your life stays wonderful. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.